It's not every day that you can say Coinbase might have just done your ecosystem a big favor, but Friday might have been just such a day for Cardano. If you feel like a sword might actually be the least efficient choice for defending a futuristic crypto city, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. As promised, Coinbase filed their brief on Friday asking the court to dismiss the SEC's case against them. Head legal guy over there, Paul Graywall, says, "Our core argument is simple. We do not offer investment contracts, as that term has been construed by decades of Supreme Court and other binding precedent. By ignoring that precedent, the SEC has violated due process, abused its discretion, and abandoned its own earlier interpretations of the securities laws." I think all those things are arguably correct, arguably. By ignoring that precedent, the SEC has trampled the strict boundaries on its basic authorities set by Congress. I actually find this argument to be the most persuasive. We have this system. Congress will delegate authority for certain topical matters. They'll give jurisdiction to agencies to regulate certain industries, certain things within industries, and Congress simply hasn't given the SEC authority to regulate crypto. And in fact, it's a hotly debated topic right now. We cover these bills all the time. There's constantly bills where they're hashing out who else to give that authority to besides the SEC. The one thing that a lot of the bills have in common is that nobody seems to want to give that authority to the SEC because they see what a train wreck it is. Paul Graywall says, "We appreciate the court's careful consideration." But more importantly, specifically for our Cardano ecosystem, is that ADA came up in this brief in a pretty prominent way. Here's that memo that Coinbase filed on Friday. Now, Cardano doesn't show up a single time in this memo, but ADA does. But it only shows up on one page. Right now, you're probably asking yourself, hey, you said ADA shows up prominently. It does. It only shows up on one page, but I think it's pretty prominent because of the scenario that gets laid out here. So we go down here to page 17 as it's numbered on the actual page of the memo. We find this paragraph. This is important. Notably, SEC officials have admitted that two tokens traded on Coinbase, Bitcoin and Ether, are commodities rather than securities. When a purchaser buys Bitcoin on Coinbase, she has no fewer and no more contractual rights than a purchaser of Dash or ADA or any of the other tokens called out in the complaint. She is entitled to delivery of her tokens, nothing more. No principled basis exists to distinguish transactions in the tokens the SEC has already conceded to be commodities and transactions in the tokens the SEC now claims to be securities. The secondary market sales of all these tokens are all asset sales carrying no post-sale contractual obligations. The Ripple court found no investment contract based on facts substantially identical to those alleged here. Here they're citing the Torres doctrine, of course. To accept otherwise would be to allow the SEC to do precisely what the Ninth Circuit said it couldn't 30 years ago, turn any sale of goods contract into a security. So there's a couple of very important things going on here. Like, I think it's very telling that Coinbase chose only two assets out of that laundry list of how many, some 11, 12, 13, somewhere around those numbers. They could have selected any of the assets on the list. Instead, they chose Dash and ADA. I know why they chose Cardano here, because Cardano has a very preferential history from a regulatory perspective, at least in my opinion. They did the ICO in Japan under Japanese law. There were no North American buyers. So the initial distribution had nothing to do with the United States. So you're pretty much relegated to the secondary markets. So I know you could argue, hey, this is just about the secondary markets, so initial distribution doesn't even matter. But it is a better history from a regulatory perspective than something like Ethereum, where you had an ICO where they decided they definitely were not going to go to Japan and do it under Japanese law. They just did a classic crypto ICO, one of the early big ones. So you've got this good history on the part of Cardano. Makes sense why Coinbase would pick it. It's also very decentralized. In fact, in terms of validation, much more decentralized than Ethereum or Bitcoin. Another really good reason to pick Cardano. But I think more important for us on our side, I understand why Coinbase would pick us, but more important on our side, I think, is what this sets up for the future. So Coinbase is basically inviting the court to look at Dash and ADA and look at Bitcoin and Ether and ask itself, the court should ask itself, if there's any logical reason why Dash and ADA would be investment contracts under the Howey test and thus securities, and Bitcoin and Ether wouldn't. And where Cardano has such a good history from a regulatory perspective, it's very hard to come to this conclusion that somehow Bitcoin and Ether are commodities and Dash and ADA, at least ADA, are securities. I don't know too much about Dash. We won't go into that in this video. This is great because the court is likely, if they do say something about this issue, the court is likely to mention, it's very possible the court will mention Cardano here, because that's what Coinbase is asking them to examine here. They're saying, hey, examine these 4 crypto assets and tell us how they're any different. We don't think they're any different. It's very possible the court will come out and say, hey, we've looked at ADA and Dash and Bitcoin and Ethereum, and we can't come up with any reason why they'd be treated differently under the Howey test. That would be a fantastic precedent going forward for Cardano. So I think Coinbase has actually done us a huge solid here. They could have chosen any assets on the list. They chose Cardano. I think they were smart to choose Cardano. Who looks better through a regulatory lens than Cardano? Of all the assets on the list, I think Cardano is going to look the very best because we're very, very decentralized. We have governance, actual on-chain governance coming, something that doesn't even seem to be on the radar for Ethereum, for Bitcoin. I mean, you've got validators can select, to support forks, things like that in Bitcoin, but you don't really have governance because, and nothing really seems to happen in terms of governance. Then you've got Ethereum where, I've joked in the past that the FOMC meetings held by the Fed seem to be more decentralized than whatever the informal process Ethereum uses for governance. So, man, it's going to be interesting to see what the court says here. The court would have to be very anti-crypto, in my opinion, to come up with some explanation why secondary sales of ADA are investment contracts, whereas those of Ethereum and Bitcoin are not. So this could be setting up a great precedent for Cardano. Granted, this is federal district court. This could get appealed to a circuit court, which could get appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're in the very early innings of regulatory scrutiny of this whole are crypto assets securities question. But still, this is setting up a great scenario, a possible great scenario for Cardano. As is often the case, thank you to Stake with Pride for bringing this page of this brief to everyone's attention so early on Friday. Finally, you might have noticed that also on Friday, we got a brand new version of the Eternl extension. Eternl, I think at this point, is definitely my go-to wallet. I mean, I have other wallets, but I find myself using Eternl over and over again. And definitely, you could say that maybe Eternl is geared more toward experienced Cardano users. And maybe there are other wallets that are good, sort of intro wallets if you've never used crypto and you haven't been in Cardano very long. But honestly, Eternl is the wallet that I find myself using day after day, every day. It's definitely my go-to wallet. So always glad to see the Eternl team making this kind of progress. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope you did all kinds of summer things if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, all kinds of winter things if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Hope you had a great weekend in any case, and you're starting out a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.